An old woman trembled in her wheelchair as icy water struck her face. Again and again. No one stopped it. No one spoke. On the road outside, a man and his German shepherd came to a halt. They were not meant to be there, but when the dog refused to move, and the man truly looked, what they uncovered inside that house was no longer coincidence. It felt like something sent from above. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Tell me below. A cold gray drizzle pressed low over the outskirts, wind threading through warped wooden fences and the skeletal remains of last season's fields. Ryan Carter moved along the roadside with the quiet, measured pace of a man who had learned long ago that rushing rarely solved anything. At 35, he carried strength without display. Tall, broad-shouldered, his frame built by years of disciplined strain rather than vanity. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, his jaw sharp beneath a light, unshaven shadow. His eyes, steady and alert, held the kind of stillness that came from seeing too much and choosing to react only when it mattered. He wore a long-sleeved green shirt with camouflage sleeves, worn pants of the same pattern, a black fabric belt, and old boots that had outlived more than one chapter of his life. There was no weapon on him, only control. Beside him walked Max, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a powerful, balanced build and a black and tan coat dulled slightly by dust from the road. His ears stood upright, his amber eyes scanning constantly, not anxious, not aggressive, but aware. Max did not bark without reason. He did not move without purpose. And when he stopped, it meant something. They had been heading nowhere in particular, the way men without stable work often did, picking up small jobs, fixing fences, hauling scrap, trading hours for just enough to keep moving. Ryan had learned to live within that rhythm. It wasn't pride that kept him going. It was something quieter, responsibility perhaps, or the simple refusal to collapse. Max slowed first, then stopped. Ryan didn't speak. He didn't need to. The dog's posture shifted, weight slightly forward, ears rigid, gaze locked beyond the wooden fence ahead. Ryan followed that line of sight. The farmhouse sat back from the road, large but neglected, its paint peeling in long strips like old scars. The yard behind it was open, exposed to the biting wind. And there, an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair at the center of the yard. She was thin to the point of fragility, her shoulders hunched inward as if trying to disappear into herself. Her hair, once silver but now dull and uneven, clung in loose strands around a pale, weathered face. Her skin looked almost translucent in the cold light, the kind that bruised easily, the kind that remembered every harsh touch. Her hands gripped the sides of the chair, not in resistance, but in something closer to endurance. A man stood in front of her. He appeared to be in his early 50s, tall with a solid, well-fed build that spoke of comfort rather than labor. His hair was neatly combed, dark with faint streaks of gray, and his face carried sharp, controlled angles. Clean-shaven, composed, but his eyes held something colder than the weather. He wore a thick coat, gloves, and boots suited for the chill, untouched by discomfort. In his hand, a hose. The water struck her full in the face. It came in sharp bursts, the pressure too strong, the temperature unforgiving. The sound alone was enough, like something tearing softly, repeatedly. The woman flinched, her body curling inward, but she didn't cry out, not once. Max let out a low, restrained growl. Ryan's hand tightened slightly at his side. Not a fist. Not yet. Just tension gathering. "Stay sharp," Ryan murmured under his breath, though his voice never rose above the wind. The man tilted his head, watching her reaction with clinical detachment. "You need to wake up," he said, his tone almost conversational, as if discussing weather, not pain. "This is good for you." The woman's lips trembled, but no words came. only breath, shallow, uneven, visible in the cold air. Ryan felt it then, the familiar shift inside him. Not anger, not yet. Something deeper, recognition. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't a moment of lost control. This was deliberate, repeated, structured. Max's growl deepened, still quiet but edged now, like a warning drawn across steel. Ryan stepped forward once, testing the ground between instinct and decision. And then Max's head turned sharply, not toward the man, toward the house. Ryan followed instantly. There, just inside the open doorway, stood another figure. A woman. She was in her late 30s, slender, her posture rigid in a way that suggested not strength, but restraint. Her hair was pulled back tightly into a low bun, a dull brown that matched the neutrality of her expression. Her skin was pale, almost drained of color, and her eyes, they weren't shocked, they weren't angry, they were watching, quietly, carefully. She wore a simple long-sleeved blouse and dark trousers, the kind chosen to avoid attention. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers interlocked just tightly enough to show tension. She did not move, did not speak, did not intervene. For a brief moment, her gaze met Ryan's, and in that single second, something passed between them. Not a plea, not exactly, but not indifference either. Then she looked away. Max's body stilled completely. Ryan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like a calculation reaching its end. This wasn't just cruelty. It was controlled, observed, allowed. And that meant one thing. This place was not broken by accident. It was built this way. The next morning came without warmth, only a pale light filtering through a sky that had not yet decided whether to clear or continue its quiet punishment. Ryan stood at the edge of the same property, boots damp from the thawing ground, his gaze fixed not on the house, but on the pattern of movement around it. He had returned before sunrise, not out of impulse but intention. Men like him did not step into a situation blind. They studied it first, measured it, let silence reveal what noise tried to hide. Max stood beside him, still and composed, but his attention never drifted. His ears adjusted with each distant sound, the creak of wood, the faint metallic clink of something being set down, the subtle rhythm of life inside a place that pretended to be ordinary. "Easy," Ryan murmured, not as a command, but as a shared understanding. The opportunity came in the form of a man exiting the side barn. He was in his late 40s, shorter than Ryan, with a thick, compact build shaped by years of physical labor. His face was rough, lined deeply around the mouth and eyes, with a short, uneven beard that suggested neglect rather than style. His hands were large, calloused, stained from work that did not often offer rest. He wore a faded jacket and worn denim, practical, but tired. There was no hostility in him, but there was something else. Avoidance. Ryan approached him casually. "Morning," Ryan said, voice calm, neutral. The man hesitated before responding. "Yeah." His tone was guarded, eyes flicking briefly toward the house before returning. "Passing through," Ryan continued. "Heard you might need help. Fixing fences, hauling, whatever pays." The man studied him longer this time. Not suspicious, evaluating. "Name's Thomas," he said finally. Ryan gave a slight nod. "Ryan." Max remained at his side, posture composed, gaze quiet, but observant. Thomas glanced at the dog once, then again, longer the second time. "That dog trained?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. "He listens." Thomas let out a short breath that might have been a laugh once. "Better than most people around here." There was something in that line, something worn. After a pause, Thomas gestured toward the barn. "There's work. Nothing pretty. You do it right. You get paid. No questions." Ryan held his gaze. I don't ask questions I don't need answers to. That seemed to settle it. By mid-morning, Ryan was inside the rhythm of the place. The property looked expansive from the outside, but inside it felt contained. Movements were predictable. Conversations were short. Doors remained partially open, never fully closed, but never inviting either. It was a place designed not for comfort, but for control. Max moved differently here. Slower, more deliberate. His nose worked constantly, picking through layers of scent that did not belong together. Cleaners, medication, stagnant air, something faint beneath it all. Something wrong. Ryan noticed the first detail when he was called into the main house to carry supplies. The woman from the doorway stood near the kitchen counter. Up close, she appeared more fragile than before. Her name, he would soon learn, was Elise. She was in her late 30s, slender to the point of strain, her collarbones faintly visible beneath her pale skin. Her brown hair remained tightly secured in a low bun, not a strand out of place, as if control over appearance was the only control she was allowed. Her eyes were light, but dulled, like something once bright that had been dimmed over time. "You're new," she said softly, her voice careful, measured. "Just helping out," Ryan replied. She nodded, but her gaze shifted quickly, to the hallway. "Keep your work outside when you can," she added, almost under her breath. It wasn't a warning. It was advice. Max stepped forward slightly, nose lifting toward the counter. There, a tray, 2 glasses of water, a small collection of pill bottles. Max didn't growl. He didn't react sharply, but his body stilled in a way Ryan knew well. That quiet alertness that meant something didn't align. Ryan moved closer, setting down the supplies slowly. The labels on the bottles were clinical, routine, but the arrangement wasn't. Too precise, too controlled. "Medication?" Ryan asked, casual. Elise's fingers tightened slightly. "For her condition?" Ryan didn't look at her. He looked at the tray. "What condition?" She didn't answer. From down the hallway came the sound of wheels. Margaret. She appeared slowly, guided not by assistance, but by routine. The same frail frame, the same inward posture. But now, closer, Ryan saw more. Her hands trembled, not just from cold, from something internal, something chemical. Max approached carefully, lowering himself to her level without threatening her space. His movements were controlled, respectful. Margaret's eyes shifted toward him. For a moment, just a moment, something changed. Recognition, not of him, of presence. Max gently nudged her hand. Her fingers twitched. Small, barely noticeable, but real. Ryan saw it. And then something else. A flicker of confusion crossed her face, as if her body had done something her mind had not expected. Elise stepped forward quickly. "That's enough," she said, her voice tighter now. Ryan leaned back, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of ease. "Just saying hello." But his mind had already begun moving. That reaction, it didn't match full paralysis. Max stayed beside Margaret, watching closely. When Elise turned away briefly, Ryan shifted the tray just enough to read the labels more clearly. The dosage instructions were there, but something about the frequency. Too often, too consistent, not as needed, controlled. Max exhaled slowly, then looked up at Ryan, and in that silent exchange, something settled between them. This wasn't care, it was management. And Margaret, she wasn't just being looked after, she was being kept this way. Rain returned that night, not as a storm, but as a steady, persistent tapping against the roof, like something patient enough to wait until truth had no choice but to answer. Ryan sat on a narrow wooden chair in the dim corner of the guest quarters they had assigned him, his elbows resting lightly on his knees, his fingers loosely interlocked. The room smelled faintly of old wood, and something medicinal that seemed to linger even where it didn't belong. He wasn't resting. Men like him didn't rest when something didn't add up. They slowed down. They watched. They waited for the smallest break in the pattern. Max lay near the door, his body relaxed but not asleep, his breathing even, his ears responding to every distant movement. His presence filled the silence without disturbing it. "Too clean," Ryan murmured under his breath. Not the house, the system. Everything Margaret was given, the water, the pills, the schedule. It was all too consistent, not adjusted, not responsive, controlled. And control, when done right, didn't leave marks on the surface. It settled underneath. The opportunity came late into the evening. Elise had been called away by the man, the son. Ryan had begun to notice how her posture changed around him, how her shoulders drew inward, how her voice became smaller, as if the air itself pressed against her when he entered the room. That left Margaret alone. Max lifted his head first, sensing the shift before Ryan moved. "Quiet," Ryan whispered. They stepped into the hallway together, their movement synchronized without needing command. Margaret sat by the window, the same position she had been placed in earlier. The light outside was faint, the reflection of rain blurring the glass into something almost dreamlike. Up close, the signs were clearer now. Her breathing was shallow but uneven, not the pattern of paralysis, but of suppression. Her fingers rested loosely on her lap, but they weren't still. There were micro-movements, tension. Max approached slowly, lowering himself beside her again, careful not to startle. He nudged her hand. This time, the reaction was stronger. Her fingers curled, not fully, not intentionally, but undeniably. Ryan watched closely, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharpened. "Margaret," he said softly. Her eyes shifted, slowly, as if moving through resistance. There was something there now, not clarity, but awareness struggling through fog. Ryan reached for the tray beside her. The medication sat where it always did, organized, prepared, predictable. He didn't hesitate. With practiced precision, he adjusted the dosage, subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but enough to create space. Space for her body to respond without interference. Max stayed beside her, his presence steady, grounding. Minutes passed, nothing dramatic, nothing sudden. But then, Margaret flinched. It was small, barely visible, but it wasn't reflex alone, it was reaction. Her brow tightened slightly, as if registering discomfort, pain. Ryan leaned back slowly, exhaling once, controlled. "She can feel," he murmured. Max's eyes lifted to meet his. The confirmation didn't come from hope, it came from evidence. Over the next day, the changes continued, subtle, quiet, but consistent. Margaret's gaze lingered longer. Her fingers moved more frequently, though still weak, still uncertain. Once, when Max brushed against her leg, her entire body tensed, not in fear, but in response. Ryan didn't rush it. He didn't push. He observed, documented in his mind, built a pattern from the fragments. And then, on the second night, the rain returned, harder this time, striking the windows with a restless urgency. That was when Max moved first. He stood abruptly, his posture shifting into alert stillness, his head turning toward Margaret's wheelchair. Ryan followed immediately. Max's nose hovered near the seat cushion. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He focused. Ryan crouched down beside him, his movements careful, deliberate. "What is it?" he murmured. Max nudged the edge of the cushion slightly. Ryan paused. Then slowly, he lifted it. Beneath the worn fabric, hidden between the layers, a folded piece of paper, old, creased, not part of the system. Ryan unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. A doctor's note, short, direct. Administer medication only when necessary. Overuse may result in muscular suppression and cognitive decline. Ryan didn't move for a long moment. The rain outside filled the silence. Max remained still beside him, as if understanding the weight of what had just surfaced. This wasn't neglect. It was deliberate misuse, a controlled weakening. Ryan folded the paper again, more carefully this time, his movements precise. When he looked up, his expression had not hardened, but something had settled deeper inside him. A line had been crossed. Not tonight, not loudly, but permanently. Morning arrived with a brittle stillness, the kind that settled over the land after a night of relentless rain, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Ryan stood just inside the main room of the house, his posture relaxed, but his presence anchored, like a line drawn quietly across the floor that no one could step past without consequence. He had not slept much, not because he couldn't, but because the moment for waiting had passed. Max stood slightly ahead of him, positioned between Ryan and the center of the room, his body calm, his stance balanced, his amber eyes fixed not on movement, but on intent. Margaret sat near the window again, but something had changed. It was subtle, almost invisible to someone who hadn't been watching closely. Her shoulders were still narrow, her body still frail, but her head was no longer angled downward in quiet surrender. It was lifted, just slightly, enough to suggest something returning. Across the room stood the man, Margaret's son. Up close, the precision of his appearance became clearer. He was tall, his posture straight with the kind of control that came not from discipline, but from entitlement. His hair, dark with strands of silver, was combed neatly back. His face was clean-shaven, his jaw sharp, his expression composed in a way that suggested he had long practiced the art of appearing reasonable. But his eyes betrayed him. They were cold, calculating, always measuring how far he could go before being stopped, and what it would cost if he was. "You've been here longer than agreed," he said, his voice even, almost polite. Ryan didn't move. Work needed doing. The man's gaze flicked briefly toward Max, then back. And now it doesn't. Silence stretched between them, not empty, but heavy. Elise stood near the doorway again, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Today, the tension in her posture was unmistakable. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes moving between Ryan, the man, and Margaret, as if she were watching something inevitable unfold, but had not yet decided whether she would be part of it, or remain outside of it. Ryan stepped forward once, not aggressively, not confrontational, just enough to shift the balance of the room. "She's not paralyzed," he said. The words landed without force, but they didn't need it. The man's expression didn't change immediately. That was the first sign. Control. Calculation. "That's not your concern," he replied. Ryan's gaze didn't waver. "It became my concern when you started treating it like a condition instead of a decision." A flicker. Small. But there. Max remained still, his presence like a silent weight pressing against the space between them. From the far side of the room, Thomas stood half-hidden near the kitchen entrance. His shoulders were tense, his jaw set in a way that suggested he had been holding something in for too long. His eyes, once avoidant, were now fixed on the man, not in defiance, but in something closer to resignation, giving way to truth. "Say it," Ryan said quietly, not looking at him. Thomas swallowed. His voice, when it came, was rough, uneven. "He told us it was necessary," Thomas said. "Said she'd hurt herself if we didn't keep her calm. The medication, it was increased. Over time." The man turned sharply. "That's enough." But the crack had already formed. Elise stepped forward then, unexpected, unsteady, but undeniable. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "It wasn't prescribed like that," she said. "I saw the original instructions. It was only supposed to be given when she was in distress. Not every day. Not like this." Her hands shook slightly, but her eyes held. "She wasn't getting worse," Elise continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "She was being made worse." The room shifted. Margaret's fingers moved again, more clearly this time. Max noticed first. He stepped closer, lowering himself beside her, his presence grounding, steady. Ryan followed her gaze. For a brief moment, Margaret looked directly at her son, not through him, at him. There was confusion there, pain, but also something returning that had been buried beneath layers of enforced silence. Recognition. The man took a step forward. "This is manipulation," he said sharply. "You don't understand her condition." Ryan cut him off, not with volume, but with certainty. "I understand patterns," he said. "And yours is simple." He reached into his pocket and unfolded the paper, the doctor's note. "This was hidden," Ryan continued, "because it didn't fit the story you needed." The man's eyes flicked to it. Just for a second, but it was enough. Max's ears shifted slightly. Ryan's voice remained steady. "You kept her weak, dependent, quiet. Easier that way, isn't it?" No one spoke, not immediately. Then from outside, the distant sound of a vehicle approached. Thomas exhaled slowly, as if releasing something that had been building for months. "I called," he said quietly. The man turned toward him, disbelief flashing across his face for the first time. "You what?" Thomas didn't step back. "I called," he repeated. The sound of tires on gravel grew louder. Elise closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, this time without hesitation. Max remained still beside Margaret, his presence unwavering. Ryan didn't move. He didn't need to. The house that had once swallowed every voice was no longer quiet. Spring did not arrive with celebration, but with a slow, patient warmth that softened the edges of everything it touched, as if the world itself had decided to loosen its grip. The house looked different now, not because its structure had changed, the same weathered wood, the same long stretch of open yard, but because the silence inside it no longer carried fear. It moved differently, lighter, like something that no longer needed to hide. Ryan stood near the edge of the porch, one hand resting loosely against the wooden railing. His posture remained the same as it had always been, steady, controlled, but there was less weight in it now, as if something he had been carrying had finally been set down, even if only for a moment. Max lay at his feet, stretched comfortably across the sun-warmed boards, his black and tan coat catching the light in quiet contrast to the cold tones that had once defined this place. His ears twitched occasionally at distant sounds, but there was no tension in him, no alert readiness, just presence. Inside, Margaret sat near the open doorway. She was still thin, still fragile in many ways, but no longer diminished. Her posture had changed first, her shoulders no longer folding inward, her back held just slightly straighter, as if her body had begun remembering something it had been forced to forget. Her hair, though still silver and uneven, had been brushed and gathered more carefully, and her skin, once pale to the point of translucence, now held a faint trace of warmth. Most importantly, her eyes were clear, not fully strong, not entirely free of confusion, but present, aware. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood beside her, adjusting a small notepad in her hand as she observed Margaret's movement with careful attention. She was in her early 60s, tall and slender, with a composed posture that reflected decades of practiced discipline. Her hair, a soft gray blonde, was tied into a low, practical knot, and her pale skin bore the fine lines of both age and experience. Her eyes were sharp, but not cold, focused, thoughtful, and grounded in a kind of quiet compassion that came from years spent helping people reclaim pieces of themselves. "She's responding well," Evelyn said, her voice calm, steady. "Motor function is returning gradually. The important thing is consistency, without interference." Margaret's fingers moved again, this time more deliberately. Not by accident, not by reflex, choice. Ryan watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable but his attention unwavering. He had seen recovery before, in different forms, under different circumstances. But this was something quieter, less dramatic, and in some ways, more profound. Because it wasn't just about healing the body, it was about returning ownership. Across the yard, a patrol vehicle sat near the gate, its presence no longer urgent, but still necessary. The investigation was ongoing. The son, Margaret's son, had been removed from the property 2 days prior. There had been no struggle, no dramatic confrontation, just the slow collapse of control when it no longer had silence to protect it. Thomas had not left. He stood near the barn now, repairing a section of fence with a focus that bordered on determination. His movements were steady, deliberate, less like a man working for wages, and more like someone trying to rebuild something he had once allowed to fall apart. His rough features remained, the deep lines in his face unchanged, but his eyes no longer avoided contact. Elise moved differently, too. She no longer kept to the edges of rooms, no longer shrank into herself when footsteps approached. Her posture was still reserved, but no longer constrained. She had chosen to stay, not out of obligation, but because leaving now would have meant abandoning something she had finally chosen to face. Margaret looked toward Ryan then. Her gaze lingered, not searching, not confused, recognizing. She lifted her hand slightly. It trembled, but it lifted. Ryan stepped forward, slowly, closing the distance without urgency. Max rose with him, moving at his side as naturally as breath. When Ryan reached her, he didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there, present, allowing the moment to settle without forcing it into something it didn't need to be. Margaret's voice, when it came, was soft, fragile, but unmistakably hers. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. Simple. But they carried the weight of everything that had been taken, and everything that had begun to return. Ryan gave a small nod, not dismissive, not modest, just acknowledgement. "You did the hard part," he replied quietly. She shook her head slightly, a faint smile forming, not out of joy, but understanding. "No," she said. "I couldn't, until someone reminded me I could." Max stepped closer then, lowering himself beside her chair. Margaret's hand moved again, this time reaching. Her fingers brushed against his fur. Max didn't move. He simply stayed. The moment stretched, not dramatic, not loud, but complete. Later that afternoon, Ryan walked the edge of the property, the same path he had first taken when none of this had been visible to anyone willing to pass by. The difference now wasn't in what had happened, it was in what no longer could. Margaret remained outside, longer than she ever had before, the sunlight resting gently across her face. No hose, no commands, no controlled schedule dictating when she could breathe freely. Just warmth. Ryan had been offered money, a significant amount. He declined it without hesitation. Instead, he asked for something smaller, something lasting. A place, a modest position maintaining the property, nothing more than steady work, enough to remain nearby without becoming part of what had once gone wrong. It was granted without question. Because some debts could not be repaid with numbers, they could only be honored with trust. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the yard, Ryan stood once more at the edge of the porch. Max rested beside Margaret. She sat quietly, her gaze no longer inward, but outward, toward something she could now choose to see. Ryan didn't step closer. He didn't need to. Some distances were not separation. They were respect, and for the first time. The house was not silent because it was afraid. It was quiet because it was finally at peace. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive as light from the sky. Sometimes, they walk quietly into broken places, in the form of a stranger who refuses to look away. God does not always stop the suffering the moment it begins, but He places people in our path who are strong enough to end it. In our daily lives, we pass by silent battles every day, behind doors, behind smiles, behind words like care that sometimes hide control. And maybe, just maybe, we are meant to notice, because kindness is not always gentle. Sometimes it is brave. Sometimes it stands up. Sometimes it changes everything. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe in goodness again. Leave a comment to honor those who are still fighting in silence. And subscribe, so more stories like this can find the people who need them most. May God watch over you, guide your steps, and place you exactly where you are needed, just like He did here.